Hey guys, my name is Jordan and I'm the DFS coach here at SaberSim. The video you're about to watch features me going through a live build using our app, building 150 MLB DFS lineups for the Friday, July 30th, 2021 MLB DFS slate that is now ongoing. Before I jump into this, I really just wanted to quickly introduce a little bit of what makes SaberSim so cool and what makes it so well positioned to build effective winning MLB DFS lineups. While other optimizers out there are using mean projections and giving you outdated tools to build your lineups, our data scientist team built a machine learning algorithm that simulates every game play by play thousands of times to come up with our projections and real ranges of outcomes. This powers everything we do, from our projections, and it gives us the ability to create the only optimizer that really understands correlation, ownership, and variance. So what does that exactly mean? It means that in this video you're about to watch, I can show you how easily you can apply your DFS strategy without having to spend hours setting up complicated rules, stack types, and groups in your lineups. So don't get me wrong overall. As you'll see, it still takes work to win. You still need to pick your spots to get leverage, add value to your process, and so on. But you don't need to spend hours setting up complicated build rules and stack types and things like that. And you can spend the limited time that you may have on your lineups applying your strategy and adding value where you can get the biggest bang for your buck. Before we jump in, I do want to note, if you're relatively unfamiliar with SaberSim, maybe you're new to the product and haven't really used it to actually build lineups for a slate, this video may not be best for you. Where I recommend you start first are the tooltips on the app. As you can see, these little question marks with the circle around them will pop up a video that explains what you're looking at each step, as well as our help doc center, support.sabersim.com. And finally, once you're a little bit more familiar with how to do things in our app, I recommend first checking out this course, Build a Winning MLB DFS Process. You can find this on sabersim.com under Resources, Strategy, Baseball, and Course. Build a Winning MLB DFS Process. That's going to give you a really strong introduction to the app and how to use it overall. If you're already using SaberSim to build MLB DFS lineups regularly and you get the basics of how to edit projections and how to edit exposures and things like that, but you're looking for a little bit more of a deep dive from somebody that's familiar with it about how I apply my actual strategies to do those things, this is the video for you. In this video, you're going to see how I use SaberSim's tools and other signals to assess the chalk and get a read on ownership on the slate overall. You're going to see how I take advantage of smart diversity in our game simulations to determine how likely it is for a certain player or stack to be optimal and therefore find leverage in my lineups. And you're going to get to see how I use SaberSim's unique approach to handling exposures by building additional lineups for us out of the box, right out of the gate. I can tweak exposures on the fly to get the proper leverage I want in my lineup portfolio without having to build additional lineups quickly. The whole purpose of this is for you to see how all of the concepts that we talk about in our office hours videos, in our other videos and strategy sessions, all comes together in my unique process so that you can maybe find some things that you like, that you want to take out of it. You can borrow heavy chunks out of it, or you can just see how somebody else does their process every single night. So I hope you enjoy. I'm going to jump right into it here. And if you have any questions about this video after you've watched it, something doesn't make a lot of sense, you can always email us, support@sabersim.com. Enjoy. The first step when I sit down on any given DFS slate is I am going to try to understand essentially what the field is going to do. My very first goal of how to tackle things is going to be figuring out what the chalk is. Where's ownership going to lie? What's the field going to do? And the reason why I do this first, and the reason why I think this is an important part of the process overall, is that it's generally much easier for humans to predict and know what humans are going to do. And while we do have ownership projections on the app, I think there is some value that can be added here, just because with a human touch, you understand some things like narratives and intuition of what DFS players are likely to do, where the model maybe isn't so perfect at predicting that kind of human behavior. We're always working on improving these models, including the ownership model. And I think for the most part, you can often leave the actual projections alone. I think the ownership is definitely a component here where you can add some additional value because we have that human component. We know what DFS players are likely to do. Right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I do that. A few other things here before I kind of jump in. Ownership is important here to look at because it does kind of provide us a baseline for how we're going to find leverage later. Right. We need to be able to compare somebody's probability of success against how owned they are going to be, at least in relative terms, before we can really decide how exposed we want to be to a certain player. So quickly, typically, the first thing that I look at when I start looking at ownership actually ends up not being SaberSim. And what it is the Vegas dashboard. So I've got the Fantasy Labs Vegas dashboard here. If you follow along in office hours, this is something that I typically use pretty often, and it's a very quick way to assess chalk. I find that the field in general, partially because so much DFS content and also DFS projection systems just follow Vegas. The field generally is very likely to just follow Vegas and kind of follow the general trends there. I have found typically, at least from what I have seen and the stakes that I'm typically playing, that the chalkiest stacks, the chalkiest 4 or 5 stacks, depending on how big the slate is. We've got a full 15-game slate tonight, are typically the highest projected team stacks by Vegas, depending on sometimes some nuance with salary. So I will sort this by highest to lowest, and I will just start taking some notes. I'm just starting to give myself an opportunity to get familiar with the slate. So I actually typically do this with a pen and paper, but today I've got my Google Doc pulled up here, and I'm going to go ahead and do it there. But I will just go ahead and start taking some notes, and I'll say stacks, and we'll say chalk, and I'll just note the first 4 or so. From there, I think ownership will get relatively distributed out, and we'll just note, so it's Toronto, Detroit, the Dodgers, White Sox, and Padres. Cool. Actually, let's go ahead and note the first 10. So it's then Cardinals, because it's a 15-game slate today, so we are noting basically the first third of teams in order that we think they're going to be chalky. Philly, and again, this is just going to be a rough estimate of what we expect for the slate. So obviously some of these teams at the bottoms aren't going to be really properly considered chalk. The other thing I'm going to do actually is I'm going to go ahead. No, I'll leave that there. Okay, and then the other thing I want to look at is pitchers. So again, similar rule of thumb, just as a means of roughly gauging pitching chalk, I think you can sort this in the opposite order and just look at what the lowest projected teams are overall, and then look at the pitcher that's pitching for those teams. So I have a little bit of a familiarity here because I did prepare for this. Typically what I will end up doing is if there is a team, like in this case, it's the Yankees. I know who's pitching for the Yankees tonight, but I'll typically just write the team and then go figure it out later. But I know it's Talon for the Yankees. For the Mariners, it's Gilbert. For the White Sox, it's Lynn. Let me move this. For the Giants, it's Gossman. And in this case, we probably don't need as many. This is Ryan Weathers. As many teams listed here. This is probably where I start to forget. I can't remember who's on the mound for the Mets tonight, but we'll just note the Mets for now. The Dodgers. We'll fill some of this in as we go. The Brewers. The Astros. And we'll say, we'll go ahead and leave it there. I think that's a good start. Okay, so we're starting to get an idea of about where the chalk teams are. There's a few other tools that we can use to go ahead and determine exactly what the chalk looks like. And one of these is what I call, and what Max has talked about here before on some of our strategy sessions, a chalk build. And what is exactly a chalk build? What we do is we are going to basically turn off the impacts of our sliders So correlation, ownership fade, and smart diversity are going to go down to 0. And we are going to set a basic stack rule that says we're going to stack 5 players from the same team. And what this kind of build is going to give us is it's going to show us what traditional optimizers are likely to build. If somebody just showed up, took a look at the optimizer, set a minimum 5 stacking rule, and pressed go, right? We're going to look at median projections. We're not going to consider all the things that SaberSim does really well, like correlations, apart from our minimum 5 stacking rule, ownership, smart diversity, things like that. This is just basic projections, and we're going to run the build. The one thing I will note here is that this will run the build with SaberSim projections overall. So when there are discrepancies between us and Vegas, they will manifest in the chalk build. If there's a team that has a particularly high or low projection compared to Vegas, that may affect what we are perceiving is going to be chalk based on this build. Tonight, a lot of the team totals are generally in line. But if you wanted to be very precise with this overall, I think the best way you could do this, and especially maybe even on a smaller slate, would be to match up your team totals over here to Vegas. Now, if you've done this before, you know that this would take some time, but you would go through with each team here and update their team total to Vegas and then run your chalk build. And that's going to give you an idea of if we adjust everything we have from projections to exactly what Vegas is expecting and then run this build, what are the kinds of lineups that a traditional optimizer would spit out, right? This can be a very strong tool, especially on a slate where you are a bit struggling to determine what the chalk is going to look like. This can be a pretty powerful tool. I'm going to go ahead and run one of these. I'm not going to make the updates and change this to looking at just Vegas odds, but I'm going to run 20 of these and just get an idea and see if there's any teams that, what this will really help me do is see if there's any teams or particular players that for salary reasons start to show up. And I can add them to my list here of teams that I'm looking out for that could be chalk. So we'll let this run for a second. We'll look at the full pool here and see what we get. Okay, so the builder seems to think at pitching, the most viable options are going to be Lynn and Burns. I'm in a general agreement about that. We are picking up Gilbert as a pretty chalky option. The guys that I think might be missing from this that I do think are likely to be a little bit more chalky are Talon and probably that group of 4 overall is what we were seeing here. Gosman and Weathers maybe then are the next guys up. On the stacks, Dodgers, here's one that's interesting. I think Pittsburgh and Chicago, this is the perfect example of what I was referring to before. Those are teams that don't have very high Vegas totals. I think what is probably happening is that we are a little bit over on them on Vegas. I wouldn't be surprised if these are teams that are showing up when we ultimately end up doing our final builds, because if we are a little bit higher on them, those are teams I want to take. But Dodgers here, Milwaukee, Toronto, if we take those 2 teams out. And again, I think if you have the time here and want to run this another time after you go ahead and update team totals, I think that can be a very good use of time overall, especially if you were kind of struggling to determine exactly what the chalk is going to look like and what the chalky constructions of lineups are going to look like. So for now, the next point I typically go to here is to actually make some adjustments to ownership projections. And the way I actually end up going and doing this on an average slate can vary a bit by slate, but I typically will always, at the very least, do it for pitchers. And I'm basically just hoping that the pitchers at the top here generally kind of fall into what I expect to happen on the slate. I think this is mostly in line. I do think one thing that jumped out to me when I was looking at this is that the 2 lowest projected teams on the slate are in fact the teams that are facing the value pitchers in Talon and Gilbert. And I think those guys are going to be really pretty chalky, right? I think Lynn and Burns are going to be very gettable each. I do think that they're going to be highly owned, probably the highest 2 owned. But I think because these 2 teams are the lowest implied run total teams on the entire slate in Miami and Texas, I really do think Gilbert and Talon are going to be popular. So I typically Some of this comes down to an intuition, to be completely honest. I typically find myself using 1.5x to 3 to 4x multipliers on the ownership projections to get guys where I want. So if I think a guy like Gilbert is likely to be chalkier than he is, it's a bit of a relative thing too compared to where other players are on the slate, but I might just bump him up to 25 and maybe Talon to 25 too, because this is really my image of how I think people are going to attack the slate. I do think there's a bit of a drop off here where you have these two aces up top and these two value plays where I think based on what we're seeing when we run the chalk build and from Vegas, it's very likely that the ownership breaks down into something like this where there are kind of 4 elite pitchers that people end up picking from. And that's kind of my personal take on this overall based on what I'm seeing. This is definitely a spot where you and I could use the exact same process here and come to slightly different conclusions if we have a little bit of an overall difference in opinion here. On the hitting side, on a 15-game slate, it can be a little bit intimidating to attack this and try to update ownership projections for every player. I will occasionally sometimes come back here after I've run some builds and make some adjustments to ownership projections of the top teams and what that will look like. So for a team like Toronto, for example, I think that these ownership projections are likely to be a little bit under projected. I think these players are likely to play a lot more of these guys, especially the top guys at the top of the order. So something that I'm likely to do here is definitely still do maybe a 2 to 3x multiplier on these to get some of these guys in order. So I think a guy like Guerrero maybe is a little bit closer to 21, and you can do this pretty quickly in your head. I'm just going to do a quick 3x multiplier on these guys and get them a bit more in line with what I think is likely to happen. So we'll just say something like this. It doesn't have to be exact. I'm just trying to get these guys a little bit more in line of where I think they're going to be. Again, I think looking at this at the top here, Vegas, and I think what a lot of DFS players tonight are going to do when they're looking at the slate is they're going to look at the hitting options and see that one team in particular is far and away the best hitting option on the slate, because the I almost said Raptors. The Blue Jays are over 1 run implied total higher than the next best team. I think that's going to be interpreted as they are far and away the best hitting spot. I think that is probably the team that is most likely to get out of control with ownership. Parsing this beyond this, while I do think the Tigers, Dodgers, White Sox, Padres, Cardinals, even like all of these teams are probably going to have highly owned players, it does get a little bit harder at this point, I think, to identify where some of that ownership is going to go versus one team or the other. So on a smaller slate or a slate where you can see based on Vegas a little bit clearer where players are going to go, I may instead make some more adjustments using this kind of method, but I'm going to go ahead and leave this here for now. I'm pretty happy overall with, I think, where my pitchers, I've still got the filter on, where my pitching ownership is and where my hitting ownership is for now. I think that's a good idea of where to start. I've also got notes on what I expect just the chalkiest teams to be overall, the chalkiest pitchers to be overall. Let's fill the rest of this in and see who's pitching for some of these other teams. Okay, so it's Carrasco for the Mets, who is on a pitch count, who I don't think is actually going to be very chalky, but we can leave it noted there. Maybe I will. I was going to do a strike through, but now I can't find it. So we'll just leave it there. Who's pitching for the Dodgers? Gonsolin, typically on a pretty short leash, so I don't know how chalky he's going to be either. Milwaukee. Okay, Burns, yep, obviously going to be pretty chalky, but interesting that the team total of the team he's facing is a little bit higher here. And who's pitching for Houston? Valdez. Okay. Okay, perfect. So now we are going to jump to our next step here in the process, which is going to be running my research build. So we have some idea of what the field is going to do. I think that is typically pretty easily identifiable, typically jumps out of the page here, looking quickly at Vegas and chalk builds and ownership projections. Again, if you are finding it hard to kind of do what I just did, looking at Vegas and getting an idea of where the chalk is going to lie, what teams are going to be popular, what I would recommend is pulling Vegas into SaberSim. In other words, updating the team totals to match exactly what Vegas has, then running the chalk build. And I think that's going to give you a very accurate idea of what lineups might look like here overall, and show you different constructions that are probably going to be used by a lot of players. Again, the value of this is that we're mimicking the settings used by a traditional optimizer, where somebody doesn't put in the work to make all of the different groups and stacking rules and player pools and things like that that you need to do on a traditional optimizer, and what kind of lineups they're getting out of that. So let's go ahead and run our research build now, because we're in a good spot here. We're starting to get an idea of what the slate looks like. And what that looks like is I will typically turn my stack rule down to just 4, because those are the stacks that I'm typically willing to play. And we will turn ownership fade down to 0 and smart diversity up to 10. And we are going to run this build. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on here and why this is valuable. So because SaberSim's projections are based on our game simulations, right? Every player's projection is actually the average across their performance of all of these game simulations we have here. Instead of using something like randomness to add diversity to lineups, we actually can pull into those game simulations, pull into that base of game simulations, and take out random sets, small sets of those game simulations to add variance, to add diversity to our lineups, and while still staying in a player's real ranges of outcomes, while looking at that player's actual ceiling and actual floor, right? Smart diversity at 10 basically is just going to use single game simulations when we determine every player's projection for every lineup. So when we build 1,500 lineups at 10 smart diversity with ownership fade off and a stacking rule and 0 correlation, or 8 correlation, what we end up getting is we get an image of what lineups that may actually win DFS contests that night look like, right? They are going to be essentially mathematical optimals for different ways the slate may play out, including the stacks and the things we want in our lineups anyway. So we'll run this here. And again, I think what's really cool about this is I'm using this here as a tool, as a part of my research process. This is not going to become my build. This is simply a research. This is a research build. That's why I call it that. And what we're going to gain out of this is that I'm going to expand and view my entire pool of 1,500 lineups. And I'm basically going to get to see 1,500 different lineups that might win given that certain set of game simulations. And exposure to those players and stacks and team types in that sense can a bit better be thought of as a probability of that player being optimal or that stack being optimal at their position, rather than using it as your actual exposure in the lineups for the research build. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment here when this build completes. But I think this is a really powerful tool, a really interesting tool, one of the cooler things that is maybe a little less known about SaberSim overall. There is this question in DFS, I think, overall about most sports in DFS can be boiled down to that how easy is it to determine the probability of success for a player? And how easy is it to determine the ownership or the extent to which the field is going to use that player? Not even necessarily a player, a team stack, a stack type, a captain for showdown, right? A lot of DFS is boiled down to those concepts. Finding your leverage in your lineups by identifying the probability of success for a player, the probability of a ceiling outcome, whatever you want to use, versus how much the field is going to use that player. And while 1,500 different combinations of different game sims isn't by any means every possible outcome of all the different ways all the games could play out, it is a lot. And it gives us a lot to work with here, and it gives us a very robust tool to determine what those probabilities actually are. So we'll let this build wrap up here a bit. While I have the time, I would say I sat down here with the intention of this being about an hour here of work and of conversation. And obviously things take a little bit longer when I'm talking through them and explaining things and narrating things. This is a process that I think typically working on your own from start to finish, once you get familiar with what I'm doing, is about a 30-minute process. This is about 30 minutes. There are a few things that I might add if I know I have more time. That would be doing a very Vegas-driven chalk build, and maybe some things that I'll mention here towards the end. If I had less time, I'll mention if there were ever things that I might chop off. But this is about a 30-minute process, so something that I would probably start 45 minutes to an hour away from lock on the average night. So let's go ahead and look at this. So our chalk build is complete. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to expand the pool to 1,500 lineups because we want to view our whole pool. It's going to say, are you sure that, well, it's not, this button comes up that says fill to 1,500, and we can click that and we'll expand and look at the full pool. And we'll give this a second just to make sure it catches its breath. Okay, perfect. So what I was referring to before now is that we have 1,500 random different optimal lineups where each one is using a different game sim of every single game. And when viewing this way, we can treat exposure as a bit of a way of saying how often is that player optimal, right? Lance Lynn shows up in 33.1%, 497 of the 1,500 lineups that were built with single game sim projections. So it is, in effect, a way of looking at how optimal that player is. And what I start doing here is, there's a few ways to go about this, but one of the things that immediately I look at is my pitchers, especially the pitchers that I've adjusted ownership projections for. Are those players efficient at their ownership? And one thing that jumps immediately off the page, and this is something that I typically expect to happen most nights, is that Talon and Gilbert are generally owned much more than their exposure, than their chance of being optimal would indicate. And this is a common trend that I notice in my process overall. I typically find that value pitchers end up being over-owned given their percent chance for success. Pitchers that are cheaply priced and perceived in plus matchups are, I think, often over-owned. Those players grade out really well point per dollar. They have very high average performances, but their ceilings aren't as high as people expect, and their downside is still massive because a lot of times these guys aren't objectively very good pitchers. So I might start taking some notes here and maybe say in pitchers, and maybe I'm noting optimal. And I may note Lynn, Burns, Gosman, Bassett. And I'm just taking some notes here, right? Ultimately, if you can tell where I'm going with this, the goal is going to be to kind of compare these two lists here, both for stacks and for pitchers here in a moment. Valdez, Talon, Gray, and Gilbert. That's going to be every pitcher that shows up in the top overall 10% of optimal lineups. And let's do the same thing for stacks. So let's look at our stacks. So we have Dodgers. Oops. And again, you can organize this. I'm kind of experimenting with this on Google Docs here tonight. I end up actually typically writing these side by side in my chicken scratch on a piece of paper when I'm doing this myself. You can explore different ways that make sense for you to do this. I think even a spreadsheet might be an easier way to read this, but I just wanted to make sure you guys could see it clearly here today. So Milwaukee and Atlanta, Philly, Oak, San Diego, Houston, Baltimore, Boston. That's enough. Baltimore, Boston. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with pitchers because they're a little bit easier. So I think the thing that jumped immediately off the page here is, first of all, that Talon and Gilbert in general, I think, are going to be a little bit overowned. So I'm going to go ahead and just start marking players that I think are inefficient for their ownership here. And I'm going to look and see if there are any players that seem efficient for their ownership. And I'm looking for players where there's just a gap between how much they're projected to be owned and how often they show up here. And a few of those guys that maybe are showing up are guys like Sonny Gray and Valdez and Bassett. And to a lesser extent, Gosman. And I think that does make a lot of sense because the field is going to perceive that there are these two elite options at the top with Lynn and Burns. And that makes sense. They do seem to be the most optimal. But given that they are 10,000, it's going to be difficult to get both one or the other of these guys and also pair them with these guys in this 9K range that still do have a lot of optimal outcomes. So I do think that's probably likely that those ownership numbers come in a little bit low for these guys and maybe is a little bit inefficient there. So that's not a crazy difference there. If you ever see differences of 2x or anything like that, where a player is 2 times 2 owned or 2 times unowned as unowned as they should be, that's kind of the red flag for me. But I'm going to go ahead and mark them anyway, because I do think they're interesting options. We'll say italics here. Let's actually do it like this. Let's do, to make it really clear, bold and red for 2 owned, and italics and a green color. Oops. For not owned enough here. Okay. And I think Lynn and Burns are probably going to be appropriately owned. If they're the 2 highest owned pitchers on the slate, they show up in a lot of optimals. They show up as the 2 highest optimal players. I think they are probably going to be appropriately owned. So we'll leave them blank. And ultimately, our goal is going to be to create leverage in our lineups based on this. A player that I don't think is going to be owned enough is a player that I'm likely maybe to set a minimum exposure for. A player that I think is going to be too owned is a player that I maybe will remove from my pool or set a maximum exposure for. And a player that I think is going to be appropriately owned, a lot of times I'll just leave alone. I just won't do anything. But occasionally I will decide to just match the field on that player if I really believe that the field is kind of just going to be really right on. A player like Lynn is someone like that where I think maybe they are going to be perfectly appropriately owned for the contest. So let's go ahead and look at the stacks for a moment here. And again, the effect I think is generally even more amplified for hitting stacks, where I think the field in general really struggles to understand the ranges of outcomes when looking at something like this. I think they overly gravitate to teams with a very small edge on their opponents. The difference between a 5-3 or a 5-2 run total and a 4-8 run total, for example. And a great deal of teams typically float to the top of the optimal list here in our sim, then they are owned, if that makes sense. So a team that immediately just jumps off the page, or the lack thereof of a team just jumps off the page, is Toronto, right? Only showing up in 4% of optimal lineups. That is a team that to me is going to be a huge flag of a team that I want to fade, right? So just to be clear overall, again, of what I'm seeing here is that we're looking at how often does a team stack in any form, 2, 3, 4, or 5 stack, show up. What percentage of lineups does that stack show up? And it's towards the bottom, only 4% of the time, right? That's a team that, to me, all of a sudden just looks like one that's going to be heavily overowned. Let's go ahead and do it this way. Let's look at the teams that we had identified as chalk first, and then go back through and look at the teams we're actually getting in the sim. So Detroit is another team that is a little bit better off, right? Not so bad. I think they're likely still to be overowned for their outcome. But let's go ahead and mark them as red too. I'm not looking for reasons to play chalky teams, right? I'm not trying to find reasons to play Detroit, who is the second highest run total on the night, and I think is probably going to be one of the chalkier teams. I'm looking for reasons to fade them. So if I can find a good reason, this is a good enough reason for me. Now, yeah, I guess no. I guess that's my point. So let's go ahead and keep going. The Dodgers is one that I think is probably going to be appropriately looked at by the field, right? We see that they're the number one team overall. They're probably going to be the second or third chalkiest team on the slate. I'm going to probably just leave them alone. I do think it is interesting that we seem to think that they are far and away the best stacked team. There's a 33% increase over the next best team. I think it's definitely a team I want to have in my pool. White Sox is another team that I think is going to be overused by the field. San Diego, roughly in the right place that we would expect. So I'm going to leave them alone, right? This can be kind of rough estimates. We don't need to get too crazy here. St. Louis. Let's make use of our computer tools here. Probably overowned. Philly. Oh. Probably about in the right spot. Tampa Bay. Probably overowned, but we're starting to get to the point down here at the bottom of the list where I'm not as interested in some of these teams, mostly because my method of predicting ownership this way is going to start to lose some accuracy as you start to get down into this list, right? We're starting to get just a lot of teams in the same mix overall, and saying that we know for sure that Tampa Bay is going to be more chalky than a team like even the A's or the Cubs starts to be difficult. But we'll continue to note them. Milwaukee is a team that probably is under based on what we're seeing here. I'm going to go ahead and mark them as green. And Washington. Again, I don't think that some of these teams at the bottom, probably about in the right spot, maybe a little under on, we'll leave it alone. I don't think some of these teams at the bottom are going to be that owned on a 15-game slate. But let's go ahead now and look at, again, our optimal lineup. So we just said Milwaukee is going to be a good play. Dodgers, again, we're going to leave alone. I actually think I'm kind of talking myself into this, that I don't think people are going to play enough Dodgers. We'll see in general how much exposure we get to them when we run our working build here, as I like to call it. I just don't think people are going to play a lot of them. Again, especially considering the indication that the builder's giving me here overall is that they are far and away the best team, right? They're 33% higher than they look in the game sims that we have for our test build here about how I might expect a team like Toronto to show up. Or something like that. So I'm actually going to mark them because I want to make sure I get exposure to them. Atlanta is one that's interesting. That team did not show up at all. And I think they even have a pretty low total. They do. And they're okay. So they are a leverage spot against Burns. So I really like that. They show up in 8% of optimal lineups. And that's one that I'm going to mark that I want to take a look at because I just want to make sure that we are not off on our projections. I want to make sure that there's no Vegas signals that are concerning overall. So I'm going to go ahead and say research. And if I'm going to commit some lineups to Atlanta overall, especially as a leverage play against somebody like Burns, I'm fine with that. I like doing that kind of stuff, but I want to research that a little bit and make sure that I am comfortable with that. So let's look at Philly. I think was right on about where we expected. Oakland. Philly, we said, yeah, was about where we expected. Oakland is another one that I think didn't show up in our list of chalky teams. What is their run total? 4.4. That might be one that there is a little bit of value there as well. They show up in quite a few optimal lineups. So let's go ahead and mark them. Green. Maybe worth just taking a quick look at them. San Diego was about where we expected. Houston's an interesting one too, up against Gossman. Similar deal to Atlanta, where you take one of probably the chalkier pitchers on the slate and you are leveraged against them. I don't think Gossman's going to be as chalky. We actually thought that he might be underowned based on his expectation here. It's interesting, but it makes sense that if there's a talented hitting team and a talented pitcher, that there's potential upside on both sides. But let's go ahead and mark this as green. And I'm going to note just real quick too that I just want to take a look there. Baltimore's an interesting team here. Team total has dropped quite a bit throughout the day. I think that's one that is probably also worth researching. We're getting down the list here a little bit to teams that are only 7% showing up in optimals. So maybe teams that aren't going to be a huge factor in our lineups overall, but are starting to show up. And we are starting to get an idea a little bit of like how we're going to attack this slate, right? The picture is getting put together. We think that there's going to be 2 value pitchers that are a bit overowned. There are 4 pitchers in an awkward price point that people are going to underappreciate given their potential to be successful. The team is going to perceive that the field is probably going to perceive that the wrong team has a higher than the rest of the teams on the slate ceiling potential in Toronto, when in reality, or sorry, maybe not in reality, but from SaberSim's perspective, it's the Dodgers. We've got a couple other teams that are going to be unappreciated, like Milwaukee and Oakland, and also some unique opportunities for direct leverage against some of the higher owned pitchers on the slate in the form of Atlanta and Houston. So we're fading a few popular teams and getting some other teams in strong hitting spots that maybe go under-owned, and also some direct leverage. We're putting the pieces together of what our builds are going to look like. So I think we're in a good spot. I'm actually just going to go ahead and chop these 2 off because we're getting pretty far down the list. I typically don't go this far. I'm really just looking for a few of my stands that I'm going to take and a few of the ways that I'm going to play the slate overall. You don't need to take a stand on every single game. You don't even need to have a stance or an opinion about every single game. You're really looking for the spots where you can add the most leverage to your lineups and the most edge overall quickly. So, and I feel like I've done that here. So let's go ahead and see here. So again, just to summarize here real quick, we ran a build at 10 smart diversity and 0 ownership as a means of looking at a portfolio of 1,500 different ways the slate could play out, and then used exposures of certain players as a way of saying how likely is it that that player is optimal for their position. From there, we compared to our notes about what we think the chalk is going to do on the slate and identified some low-owned plays that we think we might want additional ownership to, and some over-owned plays that we think we may want to fade. So the next step here is a fairly quick one depending on the slate, and it is to research the outliers overall. And that is why I noted these particular teams. If there's a team that I am surprised I got, or is a team that is directly opposed to a very chalky or a very skilled pitcher, or I just want to make sure that that's the way I want to get my leverage on the slate overall, I like to do a little bit of research and just double check the projections, the team totals, things like that against something like Vegas and make sure I'm not seeing anything concerning. So a typical way that ends up looking is for me to just compare as a starting point, SaberSim versus, I'm going to refresh my projections here, SaberSim versus Vegas and see what we got. So let's look at the Braves. We have the Braves projected at 4.2, and on Vegas, they're projected at 3.9. They were at 4.1. They've fallen down to 0.2. I'm fine with this. If it's within a half run, I'm almost always fine. And in fact, I'm almost encouraged by this, because what this is saying is that we're only 0.3 runs over Vegas overall. We are pretty much matched up with our opinion about Corbin Burns overall on the slate. And we still think that this is a team that has ceiling and optimal stack upside. So I'm on board with that. Another team is Oakland. Quick look at their 4.4. We've got them at 5.1. This is an interesting one. And this might be one that maybe this is a difference of 0.5 runs overall. There's interesting decisions to be made here at this point. I think a team that has when we are off by a full run or or there's a team that we are off by a half run and there's concerning Vegas movement in one direction, I think that's an indication that the team projection should be brought down a little bit. This is like right in the middle of that. Yes, we are we're actually 0.77 runs off here, and we have some movement, some very subtle movement down. I think this is a team that, at least for the purposes of demonstrating, I'm going to go ahead and show you what I might do here, because I already feel like I'm going to be getting some really strong leverage with some of these other teams, especially Atlanta. And let's look at Houston real quick too. that I don't think I need all this Oakland either. So Houston's at 3-6 and we've got them at 3-9. Similar deal, right? And that's really encouraging to me. We think this is a team that shows up in optimal lineups, that has ceiling potential. And that is even the case, even if they're at a 3-9 run total, right? We're generally in line with Vegas there. So let's go ahead and bump Oakland down. And what I'm going to do is I don't want to completely remove the edge I have with Oakland overall. I'm going to just bump them and meet them halfway. So let's do 4.4, which is the Vegas total, plus 5.1 divided by 2. Oh, that didn't work. 4.4 plus 5.1 divided by 2. 4.7, let's call it. I should have been able to do that in my head. I always get exposed here on office hours for not being able to do these things in my head. I'm going to say 4.7. And again, the model's really strong. It beats Vegas closing lines over a long term. I don't want to drop a team completely down to Vegas pretty much ever. But I want to make a gentle adjustment there. I was seeing that I think we're getting enough leverage with playing extra Dodgers, playing some Milwaukee, playing Houston and Atlanta in particular are teams that I think are going to be under-owned by the field. That I don't think on the one team that we were getting a lot of because we have a big discrepancy with Vegas that I need to go there. So I'm not going to. I'm going to instead make a subtle adjustment to projections to get a little less of those players. So, but by and large, on a 15-game slate, I'm making one adjustment to projections overall, and it's a team that I think we maybe are slightly over-projecting. In general, my process is not very projection-focused. I spend a lot of time looking at ownership projections. I spend a lot of time tweaking my exposures here, as you'll see in a moment, and I spend a lot of time researching. But I don't spend too much time making all these tweaky changes to projections overall because I don't think you need to. So that's my approach overall. So we will talk a little bit about some of these next steps here. So now, of course, we need a build. So let's go ahead and I call this my working build. This is the build that unless I'm seeing something very surprising, I typically end up using. And one thing you'll see here is that I typically do not do anything crazy with sliders. I am often going to adjust smart diversity up to 10 because I want the same game sims that I was using for my research build, the way I identified these teams, to populate through to my main build. So I like to play a high smart diversity. Again, I'm typically also playing a 150 max contest that is higher in entries overall. This was at 8 anyway. I don't mind taking on a little bit of additional variance while lowering my average outcome because these contests are pretty top heavy and I need a top 0.1 finish to be successful anyway. So I will typically otherwise leave my build settings set. I will set a stacking rule of 4 players from the same team because I know that I'm going to eliminate stacks that are smaller than that anyway. At a smart diversity that is at 10, you can sometimes start to get some stranger 2-2-2 stacks, 3 stacks, things like that. I want to just roll with the 4 stacks, so I'm going to set that. But otherwise, I'm not going to make a lot of changes here. The magic of what is in my process and what I do here every single day is not in the slider settings. Very important concept of this hour-long video. I'm only going to talk about slider settings for a brief moment here. So, and this is what they look like, and this is what I typically run for my build. So I will now go ahead and run this build. And this kind of marks the beginning of putting together the final lineup. So I've so far to this point, I got an idea of what the field is going to do. I got an idea of what the optimal set of outcomes for the games on the slate look like. I compared those two things together. I identified where I think the field is over-owning players, where I think the field is under-owning players and stacks, and I'm going to apply that and get the leverage I want on the slate primarily by editing my exposures in step 3. What is really cool about this is because we're going to build the full pool of 1,500 lineups ahead of time here, is that I get this playground I can kind of just play around in here and know that I'm working within the confines of the top 1,500 lineups the builder wanted to build for me anyway. So I can see how flexible certain things may be. How reasonable is it that I could fade a chalky pitcher in the chalkiest stack? Well, how far deep into the pool of 1,500 lineups do I have to go to do that? How much lower of a Saber score do I need to get to make those kinds of stands or force ownership to certain players in my pool in? Again, I can also do this all dynamically. So I can test things out and I can try things and set players at different exposures without having to build any additional lineups at all. That's because we're building 1,500 lineups right out of the box for me to work with. So very cool overall, some cool features. So we'll let this build finish. We'll start talking about exactly what the lineups are going to look like. And we will go from there. So I'll give myself just a moment to catch my breath. Okay, so on this particular stage of the process, I am often more concerned with eliminating players that are over leveraged, that the field is going to own too much, than I am with forcing exposure to plays that I think are that are under owned, right? Mostly because there are going to be less plays that are over owned than there are plays that are under owned, right? I think typically what we see is that there's like a couple of pitchers or a pool of pitchers that become the most common pitchers on the slate. And there's a stack or two or three that become the most common stacks. But one, predicting ownership on the other side of that, of which is going to be the lower owned stacks, can sometimes be hard. And I let the builder handle a lot of that for me. So in a lot of ways, we like to say that the builder acts as an advisor for you and gives you an image of how to look at the slate. I like to take that information, pass the builder back. I don't want to do any of this stuff, and then see what the builder gives back to me and lets me know how viable it is. So we can start with this. One of the first things that I'm going to do, I am now feeling very confident in. We identified that Gilbert and Talon are probably going to be over-owned given their expectation here. Even in my final build here, we're seeing that they come in under already. I'm going to eliminate these guys from my pool. I don't think there's anything wrong with being underweight on these guys, right? If he's 25% owned and we have 13%, we're going to stand to benefit more when the field, if he fails, than the field. But I'm going to eliminate these guys from my pool. I want to take a really strong stand here. I think these guys are going to be heavily over-owned based on what their expectation was. So I'm going to eliminate Talon too. And what that's also going to do is maybe give me a little bit more lineups of some of these guys that I identified might be slightly under-owned. It's not a ton, but I'm at least getting some more lineups here with some of these other guys. Gray, Gosman, Bassett. You can see I'm heavily pushed in the direction of Lynn and Burns right now, which I'm okay with at the moment. I may make some adjustments there in a moment. I want to take a look at my stacks, right? Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at this. So similar deal, I'm going to just scratch off the teams that I had identified are not the way to go here. And I don't have very much of them already out of the gate. So Toronto is one. I'm going to just remove Toronto stacks. I think we learned that they are well over-owned for their expectation, at least with my research, and Detroit as well. And the way you can kind of check your progress as you're going through this, or the way I'm going through this, is just looking at what the last lineup is and how far you've had to reach into the pool. So we have 150 lineups. We've only reached to lineup 184. To me, we've got plenty of room to go here, right? We're not reaching very far. We're getting additional leverage on the field with every move we make, and we're not having to sacrifice and dramatically move further down the pool to do this kind of stuff. So let's keep going. A few of the other things, I think that I saw that the White Sox, and I'm going to just go as far as St. Louis, are going to be over-owned for their expectation. Here's a good one. This is going to eliminate quite a few lineups. I think the White Sox are likely to be over-owned. They continue to kind of put out a weaker lineup out there too. Showed up at the top of the Vegas board. I'm going to chop them off, especially because I think it's going to allow me to start getting more access to some of these other teams I want here. Perfect. So all I'm doing is I'm setting a 0 max exposure for some of these teams. Now, of course, I'm taking an aggressive stand here. At any point, I can go back and hit reset exposure settings. And instead of setting a max exposure of 0 of some of these guys and eliminating from my pool completely, I can set a max exposure of maybe half of what I expect the field to be on these guys instead. But I'm going to take an aggressive stand because, again, I can always backstop here by looking at how deep into the pool I'm having to go to get these players. I would say my first check is when I start to hit about 500 lineups. That means I'm 1/3 of the way through my pool. If I hit 750, it's generally an indication that that is about the time to kind of stop messing around. That's probably about as far as I want to go. And what I'm doing, I just want to emphasize overall that I'm taking a pool of lineups that SaberSim saying these are all optimal ways to play. These are all lineups that look good. And I'm just sorting and picking what I want to do to maximize my leverage on the slate overall. While without getting too far out of the bounds of what SaberSim thinks are the top lineups. So I'm going to keep going here. I think that was enough there for team stacks. I'm going to now look at my overall stacks and just make sure I'm getting access to teams that I think are going to be popular. So, or that I want to be on. So I had identified Milwaukee and the Dodgers. That looks good. Pittsburgh is one that is now popping up here. A bit of a surprise, but I don't think they're going to be chalky, so I'm okay with that. I don't really even feel like I need to do too much there. San Diego is, I think, appropriately owned along with Philly. We see Atlanta starts to show up here. Houston as well. Those are my leverage stacks. Oakland does show up a little bit. Has it come down a fair bit to other stacks that are around in their area? I'm starting to feel a little bit more comfortable with that overall. One other thing I'll like to check here typically is my smaller stacks my one-offs of certain players. If I'm taking a very strong stand on a certain player or a certain stack, I may want to just double check that I'm not getting massive ownership to that player as a one-off. And really, I think there's really just one team that I'm looking at for that tonight, and that's Toronto. So it looks like we've got all these guys in about one lineup a piece. I'm going to just eliminate them. Not a big deal either way. But again, from my perspective, 150 lineups is a lot smaller than you think. And I don't know if I want to use 5 of them on Toronto one-offs on a team that I think is going to be the most popular team on the slate, that if one of these guys does have a ceiling game and gets 4 hits, he's given that many more at-bats to all of the other players on his team. So I'm going to just eliminate them. And I'm starting to feel pretty comfortable with that overall. So now let's go ahead and just take a look at our exposures. And I like to look at this in 2 ways. I like to look at who I'm most exposed to overall on the slate. And let's do it from pitchers first. And also how I'm dealing with the highest projected owned players at certain positions. This pitching situation is interesting. I think one thing I might do here, I'm going to leave this where it is for now. I'm going to leave Lynn and Burns at the top. They are the highest projected owned pitchers. I'm already taking a big stand with the value of these guys, or the value pitchers by eliminating Gilbert and Talon. I do think it would be an interesting idea to match the field on these guys. So set a maximum exposure of, say, 30. Actually, now I'm talking myself into it. I'm only at lineup 220. I feel like I've identified a way to still get more leverage on the field. And I'm going to go ahead and cap ownership on these guys and just take a look at what that does here. Okay. So so I like this more. So now what we've allowed ourselves to do is we've gotten up to 20% Gosman. We've got 17% Gray. We've got 19% Skew Ball. Well, who's not really in that group, but we've got 10% Bassett. We've given ourselves some access to some of these pitchers that are in a more difficult price point that I think there's some positive leverage on. We're taking the 2 best pitchers on the slate overall, and we're just matching what we think the field is going to do, right? Which is in line with how optimal those guys showed up. They had percent chances of being optimal that were very close to what their ownership projections were. So we're just going to cap them. We've only had to get down to the 403rd best lineup overall. And we are feeling pretty good, right? We're not even halfway through our pool, and we've eliminated the top stack, 2 of the top chalkiest pitchers, the next 2 or 3 chalky stacks in the form of like Detroit, the White Sox, and a few of these other teams. We are naturally getting enough exposure to the stacks that I wanted to see, like Milwaukee, Dodgers, Atlanta, Houston shows up here. But if we wanted to get a little bit more exposure to one of these teams, like for example, maybe Houston is an interesting one. Maybe we want 15%. That might be too much. Nope. So now we have even more. Our top lineup overall is still 690. We're still playing around with the top half of our lineups. And I'm starting to feel pretty good about this overall. And look how we're attacking this slate. We're matching the field with the 2 chalkiest pitchers. We've got a full pool, and we're getting a lot of access to a lot of the other pitchers on the slate while fading the 2 guys that we think are going to be much higher owned than their overall expectation. Let's look at our stacks. We're getting access to 2 teams that project pretty well, and Vegas seems to like, but we think SaberSim is showing us that they have a much higher ceiling outcome than the other stacks on the slate. We have 2 great leverage spots in form of Houston against Gosman and Atlanta against Burns. And then we're filling in with other stacks that had pretty solid ceiling outcomes that fit in with the other teams and the other lineup constructions that we're working with here. We've eliminated stacks of Toronto, Detroit, the White Sox, and other teams that we think are going to be extremely highly owned compared to their ceiling outcome. And we've got a pretty decent set of lineups here overall. I'm feeling pretty good about this. The last thing that I'll note is that I actually typically end up sorting these by projected score. We'll see if that does anything dramatic here. It takes us down to the 850th best lineup instead. Not a dramatic change. The primary reason that I do that is 2 reasons. One, because I'm using a 10 smart diversity. I like to hedge some of that back by sorting by projected score a little bit. And 2, because of my contest entry portfolio overall. I play a lot of different contests. The biggest contests are typically the 150 maxes, but I have single entries here. I have satellites. I have other similarly smaller sized contests and things like that. And I like to sort and fill my contests overall with a lineup sort that is static, and projected score is static. It won't change between builds. Saber score could potentially change between builds. I've talked about this more a bit in office hours. If you are curious a bit more on that, I am happy to talk about that a little bit more. But that is why I like to do that. And I think we are very close to kind of a final pool of lineups that I am pretty comfortable with overall. So I'm going to go ahead and click save. We'll give this a moment just to catch its breath here. You can see up here, it's saved at 435, getting close to lock. I think the last thing I will notice, or I will mention, is this was run at 421. We don't have all the lineup cards in yet. I have a very clear idea in my head of the way I'm going to attack the slate now. I am likely to run one more build at about 4:50 my local time, 15 minutes or so between lock, because I know that I can very quickly make some quick adjustments and get my exposures where I want them. I'm not starting my whole process over or something like that. But if lineups come out or lineup cards come out at this point in the game, I'm likely, if I still have 15 minutes before lock, I'm likely to run one more build and quickly make these updates again the same way we just saw. So maybe boost some exposure to Houston, eliminate Toronto, Detroit, etc. That's why I take notes, so I can quickly go back and I know what I need to do if I want to run one more final build before lock. So I, in this case, probably will here one more time because there are not all the lineups out, and I think we are likely to get a couple more before lock, and I just want to make sure that they're incorporated into my lineups because my player pool for 150 lineups is enormous, and I want to make sure that I have the latest info in there. So, but we'll go ahead and upload our lineups, and we've got them in. Awesome. Cool. So we are all set. So overall, key takeaways from what we just saw. First of all, I talked for an hour about my overall approach to the slate tonight, and very, very, very little of it was setting rules or build rules or editing the actual projections and things like that, tedious manual work, right? A lot of what we sat here doing was strategy, research, figuring out our approach to the way we want to handle that slate. And the reason we can do that is because SaberSim's unique approach to game simulations and the way we handle correlations and exposures, all these things are intended to make the process easier for you so that you can spend the limited amount of time that you may or may not have for DFS on strategy, on the things that matter, on adding value. And that's what my process ends up ultimately looking like. I like to look at Vegas, ownership projections, and chalk builds to determine what the field is going to do. I like to take advantage of smart diversity and the leveraging our game simulations to figure out what is optimal and what the overall probabilities of ceiling outcomes are. I take notes and like to decide overall what my approach is going to be for a slate. And I execute and find a lot of my leverage points for a given slate by taking advantage of SaberSim's cool approach and unique approach to handling exposures here. I can test different approaches of how much leverage I need to get by playing around in the playground of 1,500 lineups it builds for me and seeing how far down the pool I have to go to get the leverage points I want. We saw that on a big 15-game slate like tonight. I'm fading the two chalkiest value pitchers. I'm capping ownership to the two chalkiest pitchers overall. I've eliminated top two of the chalkiest stacks, but I'm going into the slate with a set of lineups that I feel like are really well leveraged overall for the slate and show up in a great deal of optimals. And I feel very strong about my stance overall. This whole process of coming up with a unique pool of lineups that are unique to my overall approach to the slate really only took us about an hour here to walk through. Doing this solo and kind of doing this on your own, I think this is maybe about a 30-step process once you get familiar. Feel free to take things from this. If you think there are things about my process that are interesting, that are cool, that you want to borrow, feel free to take things like that. Feel free to try doing my entire process from the ground up and seeing how it works from you. If this didn't resonate with you and you don't like this approach, that's fine too. You don't have to use this stuff. If you have questions overall about anything that I did, if something doesn't make sense, if it feels like I glossed over something or didn't explain why I did a certain thing, shoot us an email at support@sabersim.com, and I'm happy to explain why I took a certain action or did something if it wasn't very clear in the video. But overall, I hope this was helpful for you guys. I hope this was interesting. Our goal is to hopefully do a few more of these again. And again, I just want to reiterate one last time here that it really is SaberSim's unique approach to simulating games and leveraging those game simulations in the form of smart diversity and correlation that allows us, one, to not have to spend the time setting up tedious rules and stacking types with the limited amount of time we have for DFS every day. But two, it also gives us a unique set of tools that allows us to expand our processes and get deeper and sounder research of doing things like research builds and managing our exposures and things like that in our actual process. So thank you to everybody that tuned into this. Let me know if you have any questions at all. Good luck on the slate tonight. I'm excited for it, and I will talk to you guys next time. Take care.